Open on a September afternoon in east-central Iowa. Sky the color of skim milk. The dry ground under 100 pairs of feet, turning to dust. The auction is being held on the Whitaker place itself. Ray Whitaker's tractor, a rusted-out truck chassis, and the old dairy barn all in the frame behind the podium. Merle Kinney, auctioneer, red shirt, straw hat, is running lot 47. He holds up a rusted red metal toolbox with a wire handle wrapped in friction tape and a brown paper tag flapping in the breeze. Assorted hand tools, as is, folks. 20 gets you started. Do I hear 20? Nobody bids. He drops to 15. Then 10. A ripple of pity laughter starts in the front row. Eleanor Whitaker, 68, grey hair pulled back, brown patterned blouse and the olive skirt she wore to Ray's funeral, 9 months ago, raises one thin hand, 30. The crowd laughs outright. She has just bought her dead husband's own toolbox back for $30. Ellie did not lift her eyes as she paid. She counted the bills out of a coffee tin she had brought from the kitchen, because her checking account had $2,340 in it, and a property tax bill coming due in 90 days. A man in a green shirt and a ball cap pointed at her over his wife's shoulder and said something that made another man laugh. Ellie carried the toolbox by its taped handle to the tailgate of her old Ford and set it there, and only when she was alone in the cab did her hands begin to shake. She did not know yet that $30 would do what $400,000 couldn't. She did not know yet that Ray had built that toolbox the way a man builds a boat, for one person to carry them across. She only knew it was heavier than it should have been. But to understand the toolbox, you have to understand the funeral. And to understand the funeral, you have to understand a man named Ray Whitaker, who spent 44 years being called quiet by a wife who knew better, and who spent the last 11 months of his life doing something none of them noticed. Because before the auction, before the laughter, before the $30, there was a marriage nobody at that auction had ever really seen. Eleanor Marie Whitaker, born Eleanor Marie Vogel, grew up on a hog farm 3 miles east of where she would spend her adult life. She married Raymond Whitaker in June of 1979, when she was 24 and he was 26, in the Lutheran church in town, and she wore her mother's dress with the sleeves let out an inch. Ray was a third-generation dairyman and a machinist by inclination. He could fix any piece of equipment on any farm in the county, and did, usually for cash or a case of beer, or a promise to help him bail in July. The Whitakers ran 42 milking Holsteins, 80 acres of pasture on the south end, 60 in corn to the north, and Ray's shop, a red-painted pole barn behind the house, was known from Anamosa to Vinton as the place you took a hay baler when nothing else worked. Ellie ran the books. She had a green cloth-bound ledger she had kept since 1981, in which she wrote every quart of milk sold, every bag of feed bought, every hour of Ray's side work billed, every hour uncollected. She was not a bookkeeper by title. She had never been called that by anyone but Ray, who had once at their 25th anniversary dinner raised a glass of iced tea and said to a table of embarrassed neighbors, "My wife is the reason I still own my own name." People smiled politely and did not understand what he meant. Ellie did. They had one son, Kevin, born 1981, who left for Cedar Rapids after community college and became an IT manager at an insurance company. He came home for Christmas and for 1 week in August. His wife Nicole was pleasant and never quite looked Ellie in the eye. There were 2 granddaughters Ellie saw 4 times a year. Ray had a younger brother Dale, who farmed 300 acres 2 miles west and had always been the louder Whitaker, the one who spoke first and paid last, the one who in 2019 had co-signed with Ray on the loan for a new skid steer, and had, quietly, been late on his own equipment payments ever since. Ellie kept that page in the green ledger too. She did not tell Ray she had noticed. When Ray was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in November of 2022, the doctor gave him a year at the outside. He lived 11 months and 3 days. He died on a Tuesday in early January in the front bedroom, holding Ellie's right hand, and she took the wedding band off her left hand the day of the funeral, because she could not bear to be the only one still wearing one. The auction was not Ellie's idea. It was not at first anyone's idea she was told about. Dale came to the house 6 weeks after the funeral, sat at her kitchen table, and drank 2 cups of coffee before he mentioned the loan. Ray and me were on that skid steer together, Ellie. You know how that works. She said she knew how that worked. He said the bank had begun to move on the note, and that the fastest way to clear it was to sell down. Just the equipment, he said. Nothing personal. Nobody's asking you to leave the house. He said this looking at the wall, not at her. She had been married to a Whittaker for 44 years. She knew when one of them was lying by the angle of his jaw. Kevin came out from Cedar Rapids the next weekend, sat in Ray's chair, which nobody had sat in yet, and said, "Mom, Dale ran the numbers. It's the smart play. Get out from under the debt. Get liquid. You don't need the shop. You don't need the equipment. None of that stuff has any real value anymore. It's rusted junk." His phone buzzed twice while he spoke. He didn't look at it. She noticed he didn't look at her either. She said, "Your father built that shop." Kevin said, "Mom, Dad's gone." He said it the way a man closes a door. The paperwork was filed in probate on the 8th of September. Dale was co-executor by the terms of Ray's decade-old will, drafted when both brothers were healthy, and the loan had not yet been signed. Kevin, as sole heir alongside the surviving spouse, signed the consent for the personal property sale. The land itself, house, Homestead 40, South Pasture, was held jointly with right of survivorship in Ellie's name now. But the equipment, the tools, the contents of the shop, Ray's cassette player, the green-shaded lamp above the workbench, the rusted red toolbox Ray had carried to 100 farms in 40 years. All of that was estate personal property, and all of it went on the block. The auction was set for September 24th, a Saturday. Ellie was told about it on a Wednesday, and by Wednesday afternoon the yellow flyers were already tacked to the co-op bulletin board in town. She drove past one at the cases on Highway 30. She sat in her truck for 11 minutes looking at it. Kevin called her Friday night. "Mom, I'm not coming out for it. I don't want to make it a thing. Dale's got it handled." Then, softer, "You don't have to be there either, you know. In fact, maybe you shouldn't be." Ellie hung up without answering. On Saturday morning she put on her funeral skirt and her mother's cardigan and drove herself the quarter-mile down her own driveway to the yard where 100 people stood on ground her husband had walked every day of his adult life, waiting to buy pieces of him for coins. She stood at the back. She said nothing. She watched them sell Ray's tractor for $18,000, his skid steer for $22,000, his welding rig for $4,000. She watched the wedding ring, which she had put in the estate lockbox because she could not touch it, sold in a lot with 3 other rings for $850 to a jeweler from Waterloo. She did not cry. She did not lift her head. She waited. She had come for one thing. Lot 47 came up at 2:14 in the afternoon. By then Merle Kinney's voice was hoarse, and the crowd had thinned to the buyers who were there for scrap, and the neighbors who were there to gossip. Dale was in the front row in his good jacket, arms crossed, laughing at something the man beside him had said. Merle held the toolbox up over his head, Ray's rusted red toolbox, the one that had lived on the 3rd shelf of the shop bench for as long as Ellie had been married, and said, "All right, folks, lot 47, Ray Whittaker's old hand toolbox, assorted contents, as is, no warranty do I hear 20. Nobody bid. 15, nobody bid. 10, come on boys, $10 for 100 pounds of wrenches." A man in the back said, "That thing's more rust than metal, Merle." 5. The crowd laughed. Ellie raised her hand and said, 30. The laughter changed shape. It was not, for the first second, unkind. It was startled. Then Dale turned around in the front row and saw who had bid, and Dale, who had been drinking coffee spiked with something since noon, laughed out loud, a big, easy, brotherly laugh, and said, $30 for her own damn junk. All right, Merle, sold to the widow. And then the laughter turned. The man in the green shirt pointed. The woman in the plaid shirt tilted her head back. A younger couple in the front giggled behind their hands. Merle brought the gavel down and said, still laughing, "Sold, $30 to the lady of the house." Ellie walked forward through a corridor of people, who parted for her the way people part for something they do not want to touch. She paid Merle in 1s and 5s out of her coffee tin. She signed the receipt, E.M. Whitaker. She lifted the toolbox by its friction-taped handle. It was heavier than she had expected, heavier than she remembered, and she thought, briefly, that grief had made her weak. She carried it to the truck. She set it on the tailgate. She got in and shut the door. She had, in her joint checking account, $1,340, because $30 had just come out. She had $186 in the coffee tin. She had a house in her name, and a property tax bill for $8,200, due December 22nd. She had no equipment, no shop tools, no wedding ring, no husband, no son who would answer the phone that night, and one rusted red toolbox on the tailgate of her truck. She should have felt annihilated. What she felt, sitting there with her hands on the steering wheel, was something she could not name. A low, steady certainty, like a hand at her back. Ray had wanted her to buy that toolbox. She did not know why, but she knew. She drove the quarter-mile home. She did not open it that first night. She could not. She set it on the kitchen table, and she sat across from it, and she watched it the way a person watches a letter they have not yet learned how to read. Ellie left the toolbox on the kitchen table for 3 days. The house, in those 3 days, was very quiet. The auction had emptied the outbuildings and the shop. The pole barn behind the house, Ray's Kingdom, red-painted, tin-roofed, 40 feet by 60, with the green-shaded lamp still hanging over the workbench because nobody had thought it worth taking down, stood open and echoing. She walked out there on the second morning with a coffee cup, and Pete, Ray's border collie, 13 years old and stiff in the back hips, walking behind her without being called. The shop smelled the way it always had. Cold concrete, old motor oil, sawdust from the workbench, the faintly sweet char of a welding tip. Everything else was gone. The pegboards were empty. The rolling tool chest was gone. The vices were gone from the bench. Even the coffee can of assorted bolts Ray had kept for 30 years was gone. What remained were the bones of the room and the smell. She stood in the middle of the shop floor, and Pete lay down on the concrete near the bench and put his chin on his paws. She said out loud, "Well, Ray?" Her voice came back to her a little from the tin roof. She did not say anything else. On the third morning she brought the toolbox out to the shop and set it on the workbench under the green-shaded lamp. Now, up close, in the shop's light, she looked at it the way she had never quite looked at it in all the years it had lived on that shelf. It was maybe 18 inches long, 10 wide, 8 deep. The red enamel paint was mostly gone. Where it survived, it was cracked in the pattern of a dried-out riverbed. Rust bloomed along every seam. The wire handle, doubled and wrapped in black friction tape, was the newest thing on it. Ray had rewrapped it maybe 5 years ago, she remembered, because he had complained the old wrap was gone slick. The lid was dented on the left corner, an old dent she had never asked about. There was no manufacturer's mark visible anywhere. The brown paper auction tag was still tied to the handle. Lot 47, assorted hand tools, as is, $30, buyer E.M. Whitaker. She took the tag off and folded it into her cardigan pocket. She lifted the lid. Inside was what she had known would be inside, because she had watched Ray put these things in and take them out for 44 years. The 2 adjustable wrenches, the 3 flat screwdrivers, 1 Phillips, the pair of channel lock pliers with the red painted handles, the ball-peen hammer with the hickory shaft, the tape measure with the split case, the old spark plug socket, the little box of assorted washers. It was, from the top, exactly what the auctioneer had said it was. Assorted hand tools. As is. She stood looking at them for a long moment. Then she began, one by one, to take them out. She took out the tools carefully and laid them on the bench in the order she took them. The way Ray had taught her to lay out any job. Everything visible, everything findable. Wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, hammer, tape, socket, washers. Beneath the tools was the shallow removable tray that had lived in the box as long as she had known it. A rectangle of pressed steel with 2 dividers. She lifted the tray out by its 2 thumb holes. The tray came up. It should have come up light. It did not. She set the tray on the bench beside the tools and reached her hand back into the toolbox to feel the bottom. The bottom of the toolbox did not feel like the bottom of the toolbox. It sat too high. She had expected her fingers to go down another 3, maybe 4 inches. They went down maybe an inch and a half. She rapped the interior floor with her knuckles. It sounded hollow. She sat down on the shop stool. Pete lifted his head. She thought first of Ray in the last weeks. In the hospital bed they had moved into the front room, and how many afternoons she had gone out to the shop to bring him a screwdriver or a shim he had suddenly asked for from the bed. How he had said, twice, "Take your time in there, Ellie. Look around. It'll be yours." She had assumed he had meant the shop generally. She had not thought about the toolbox. She thought of what Dale had said at the kitchen table. Nothing personal. She thought of Kevin. Rusted junk. She thought of the weight of it on the tailgate, heavier than she had expected. Heavier than tools alone should have been. She reached her hand back inside and ran her fingers along the seam where the false floor met the wall. Along one long edge, she found, under the rust, under a decade of oil residue and dust, a shallow slot cut into the metal, just wide enough for a fingernail. Ray's work. Nobody else's. Ray had cut that slot with the small file he kept in the drawer he had once told her, laughing, was for his quiet projects. She got her thumbnail into the slot and lifted. The false floor came up. Under the false floor, folded in half and then in half again to fit, was a piece of yellow legal pad paper. On top of the paper, taped down with a strip of blue painter's tape, was a small brass key. Nothing else visible yet. The paper covered whatever else was underneath it. She lifted the tape carefully. She took the key. She sat with it in her palm for a moment, a small ordinary key, the kind that fit a padlock or a small filing cabinet, and then she set it on the bench and unfolded the paper. Ray's handwriting. Block letters. The way he wrote when he wanted a thing to be unmistakable. She read it once. She read it again. Then she said, "Oh, Ray," and her voice cracked on his name for the first time since the funeral. "Ellie, if you're reading this, they did what I said they'd do. The heavy things are yours, Ray." That was all it said. 18 words. She folded the paper and put it in her cardigan pocket next to the auction tag. She held the brass key in her closed fist. She did not, that afternoon, lift the false floor all the way out. She did not look under it yet. She was 68 years old, and she had just been laughed at in front of 100 people, and she had been widowed for 9 months and 3 days, and she needed to sit for a while in the fact that Ray had known. Ray had known what they would do, and he had prepared for it. And he had prepared for her. She sat on the shop stool with Pete's head on her foot, and she watched the green-shaded lamp make a soft yellow circle on the bench around the open toolbox. She thought about the crowd. She thought about Dale's laugh. She thought about Kevin saying rusted junk. She thought, very quietly, you didn't know him at all. Then she said out loud, "To the shop, all right." She reached back into the toolbox and lifted the false floor the rest of the way out. Underneath was a canvas-wrapped bundle tied twice with baling twine. Not small, perhaps 6 inches by 10. Heavy for its size. Under the bundle, she could see the corner of what looked like a leather-covered book, and beside that, 3 flat black rectangles she recognized as cassette tapes, and beside those, a manila envelope, sealed, with something written on the front in Ray's block letters. She did not lift any of them out yet. She looked at all of it, the whole architecture of it, laid out below the false floor of a rusted red toolbox nobody had wanted to bid on, and she understood, in a way she could not yet articulate, that her husband had built this for her over years. Not months, years. She closed the lid. She locked the shop. She went inside and made herself a cup of tea, and she sat at the kitchen table with the folded yellow paper in front of her, and she did not open the toolbox again until morning. In the morning, she would begin at the bundle, because the bundle was the heaviest thing. She came out to the shop at 6:30 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and a pair of reading glasses she had not worn in a year, because Ray had always been the one to hand her the mail. Pete followed. The morning was cold enough to see her breath. She turned on the green-shaded lamp, and it made the workbench look, for a moment, exactly the way it had looked the last time Ray had stood at it, the last morning of November, before the hospital bed had come into the front room, and he had stopped walking out of the shop for good. She opened the toolbox. She lifted the canvas bundle out onto the bench. The canvas was old, brown duck, faded, softened at the corners the way canvas softens after years of being handled. The baling twine was fresh. She cut the twine with the pocket knife she carried in her cardigan, and folded the canvas open. Inside were bonds. She knew what they were the second she saw them, because Ray had brought one home in 1998, the year Kevin turned 17, and had shown it to her at the kitchen table. A Series EU-US savings bond, he had said. You put in 50, in 20 years it's 100, he had said. I bought one for Kevin's college fund. She had said, that's nice, Ray. She had not thought about it since. She counted the bonds. There were 34 of them. They were in denominations of $500, $1,000, and $2,000 face value. The dates ran from 1998 through 2018, 1 or 2 a year, most years, some years 3. Every single one was made out to Eleanor M. Whitaker. Not Kevin, not Ray, not the estate, her. She sat down on the shop stool. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now. What she did was take her reading glasses off and set them on the bench, and press the heels of her hands against her eyes for a long moment, and breathe. 34 bonds, 20 years of them, every one in her name. She did not, at that moment, add them up in her head. She would add them up later, at the kitchen table with the green ledger open, with a mechanical pencil sharp. She would find, in that later edition, that the face totals came to a shade over $86,000 at maturity, because Series EE bonds, held to their 30-year term or their maturity, double from their purchase price, and Ray had bought them at half face. And that number, when she got to it, would be smaller than what she felt now, and larger than what she felt now, and both at once. For now, sitting at the bench in the early cold, she picked up the top bond in the stack and turned it over. On the back, in Ray's block letters in pencil, was written a single word, Ellie. She picked up the second. Same word, Ellie. Third, Ellie. She went through all 34. Every one of them had her name written on the back in Ray's pencil. Not required. Not needed for the bond to be valid. Just a mark he had made, one at a time, at the kitchen table on nights she must have been asleep. For 20 years. She put the bonds back into the canvas. She retied the twine. Then she reached back into the toolbox and turned over the false bottom tray, because she had a suspicion, and her suspicion was right. On the underside of the false floor, in Ray's block letters, in the same soft pencil, was a note. Under the first line she had already read was another, a small one, almost a footnote, and this line she had not seen the day before, because the paper had been covering it. P.S. Don't tell Kevin about these until after you've bought the south pasture back. He'll want a piece. He hasn't earned a piece, Ray. Ellie read that line twice. Then she said softly, Ray, and then softer, all right. The decision at the end of rung 1 was this. She would not, that afternoon, call Kevin. She had planned to. She had woken up thinking she would. Ray had asked her not to, in a PS, in pencil, on the underside of a false floor in a rusted toolbox. She would honor him. She placed the canvas bundle back in the toolbox, on top of the leather book and the cassettes and the sealed envelope, and closed the lid. She locked the shop. She walked to the house. At the kitchen table she opened the green ledger to the back and wrote, in her own hand, small and careful, 34 bonds, all EMW, approximately $86,000 at maturity. Do not tell Kay yet, Ray. The bundle was only the top layer. Under the bundle was the book. And the book, Ellie thought, was going to have names in it. She waited a day. Not out of caution. Out of respect. The bonds needed a day to sit in the world before she added anything to them. On the morning of the second day, she came out to the shop, opened the toolbox, moved the canvas bundle aside, and lifted out the leather book. It was small, perhaps, 6 by 4 inches. Brown leather cover soft from handling. The corners scuffed. On the front cover, in ink faded to sepia, In a careful hand she recognized as Ray's from the days when he still wrote in cursive, R. Whitaker, Shop Acts. She opened it. The inscription was on the inside of the front cover, and it stopped her cold. Every man in this book owes us. Some of them will come to the auction and pretend they don't remember. You remember for both of us. She sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she began to turn pages. Ray had kept the book from 1999 forward. He had written in it in pencil and later in ink. In his block letters dated entries by month and year. Each entry named a man, the job, the agreed price, and what had been paid. Where nothing had been paid, the balance was underlined. Where partial, the remainder was underlined. Where paid in full, the entry was crossed through with a single neat line. She read every page. There were 22 men in the book. Some of the names surprised her, most did not. Roy Peterson, 3 doors down, owed $340 from 2004 for a hay baler rebuild. Jim Hollister at the Co-op, $1,200 from 2011 for a full-engine teardown on his combine. Milt Anderson, $2,400 from 2015 for a welding job on a grain bin auger. Bud Kransky, whose son ran the equipment yard now, owed $6,800 for the 2018 rebuild of a tractor transmission that had run 5 more years on Ray's work. Dean Willoughby, $4,100. The Larson brothers together, $7,900. Curtis Omi, $2,200. The underlined balances, when Ellie added them at the kitchen table that night, with her mechanical pencil and the green ledger open beside her, came to $41,200. But it was not the money that stopped her. It was one specific page, page 34, dated August of 2014. She read it 3 times. Dale W., bearing pack and shaft repair on skid steer. Own labor and parts. Agreed $1,800. Paid 0. Underlined. And in the margin, in a later ink, she recognized the pen from the drawer in the front room. One Ray had used in the last year. Ray had written a note. Dale paid nothing on this. 1. Don't chase him, just keep the page. Ellie set the book down. Dale Whitaker, her husband's brother, who had co-signed a loan Ray had taken on to save both their operations, who had come to her kitchen table 6 weeks after the funeral and drunk 2 cups of coffee and looked at the wall and talked her into an estate auction. Dale had owed his own brother $1,800 for 9 years and had paid none of it. She did not feel angry. That is the strange thing to say, and it is true. She felt clarified. She felt like a landscape she had been walking through in fog had lifted, and she could see now every rock, every fence line, every gully she had suspected was there. She read the whole book through a second time by lamplight. She noticed, in the last 12 months of entries, that Ray had begun writing longer margin notes. He had begun to name motives. Bud is honest, but slow. Give him time. Milt will pay if you ask him at church, not at the yard. Dean will pretend he doesn't remember. Show him the page. Curtis is broke. Release him. Roy will pay in a lump when his beans come in. 9 pages of margin notes. A husband, training his wife, from the far side of a diagnosis, in how to be paid what she was owed. She thought of the auction. She thought of who had been in the crowd. Roy Peterson had been there in the front row. Milt Anderson had been there. Bud Kransky's son. Dean Willoughby had bid on the welding rig. They had all been there. Some of them had been laughing. The decision at the end of rung 2 was this. She would collect the debts. Not all of them at once. Not aggressively. But she would collect them, and she would use the small leather book as her only paperwork. And she would say to each man exactly what Ray had told her in the margin to say. She would begin with Roy Peterson. Because Roy Peterson was honest and slow, and because Roy Peterson's beans had come in. She closed the book. She closed the toolbox. She put the ledger in her cardigan pocket. She walked to the house and stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking out the window at the empty pole barn. And she said softly to Ray, or to nobody or to herself, "You have been keeping score for both of us, haven't you?" Under the ledger were the tapes, and under the tapes was the envelope, and on the front of the envelope she had already seen, she could not unsee, the words, "For Ellie, open last. She was going to open the tapes next. That had been her plan since morning, but when she came out to the shop and opened the toolbox, she saw something she had missed the night before, tucked between the ledger and the cassettes, a large folded envelope, unsealed, unmarked on the outside, the kind of manila envelope you buy at a farm supply store. She lifted it out. Inside were sketches. Ray had drawn them in pencil on plain white printer paper, and then he had gone over them in fine-tip pen. There were 11 sheets. They showed a modification to a hay baler tension arm, a redesigned spring-load system with an adjustable secondary tensioner that Ellie, who could read a machinist's drawing because she had watched Ray sketch on the backs of feed receipts for 44 years, understood at once. It was clever. It was more than clever. It solved a problem she had heard Ray curse at over dinner 100 times. The hay baler that could not adjust for wet windrows on the fly. Behind the sketches were 3 documents. The first was a receipt from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, dated June 14, 2022. Provisional patent application filed. Applicant Raymond J. Whitaker. Filing fee $150. Confirmation stamp. The second was a letter typed on letterhead Prairie Line Equipment Company, Waterloo, Iowa, dated August 3, 2023. 5 months before Ray died. Addressed to Ray. 2 paragraphs. The company had reviewed the provisional application. They were interested. They wished to open discussions of assignment. They named a preliminary figure in the range of $90,000 to $120,000 lump sum, with potential royalties per unit manufactured. Terms to be negotiated. The third was Ray's own note to her, folded into thirds, addressed on the outside in block letters, Ellie Ree, Prairie Line. She opened it. The idea was mine, but the numbers were yours. You're the one who told me the tension was off in 19. Prairie Line wants it. If they've offered less than 120, tell them no and don't be polite about it. She read it twice, then a third time. She remembered the conversation from 2019. She had been driving Ray back from the co-op in July and had said, offhand, that baler's rougher on wet hay than it needs to be. You'd think somebody could put a second spring on it. Ray had grunted. She had thought no more about it. Ray apparently had thought about it for 4 years. She set the patent papers back in the manila envelope. She set the envelope on the bench. Then she lifted out the cassettes. 3 of them standard black cassette tapes in clear plastic cases. Labels in Ray's block print, Ellie 1, Ellie 2, Ellie last. The shop had a cassette player. It had always had one. It was one of the few things nobody at the auction had wanted, and so it had stayed on the shelf above the workbench, dusty, its cord coiled around it. She took it down. She plugged it in. She put in Ellie 1. She sat on the shop stool. She pressed play. Ray's voice came through the small speaker, a little thin, a little tired, the way his voice had been in the last months, but unmistakably his. I know how they'll do it, Ellie. Dale will move fast because he always moves fast when he's scared. And Kevin will let him because Kevin never learned to sit still with a hard thing. They'll sell the shop out from under you before I'm cold. That's fine. I'm counting on it. Whatever else they take, they'll never take a rusty toolbox. Men look at a rusty toolbox and see a rusty toolbox. The tape hissed a few seconds, and then Ray coughed, softly, and then the recording ended. Side A was 3 minutes long. Side B was blank. Ellie sat with her hands on her knees. She put in Ellie 2. You were never quiet because you had nothing to say. You were quiet because you were listening. I listened too. That's why I picked you. That tape also was short. Perhaps 2 minutes. Ray talked, in the rest of it, about the south pasture, about the fence line he had walked in the fall of 2022, and how it needed one section rebuilt near the creek, about the color of the light on the pasture in October, about how he had always thought if he had been a different kind of man, he would have painted it. She did not put in Ellie last. That one, she understood without having to think about it, was for later. That one went with the envelope. She turned off the cassette player. The decision at the end of rung 3 was this. She would call Prairie Line Equipment Company on Monday morning. She would not be polite about the number. because Ray had told her not to be. She would also, on Monday afternoon, drive to Roy Peterson's and collect the $340 Roy Peterson had owed her husband since 2004, and she would begin, from Roy, to work her way through the book. Under the tapes was the envelope, the one that said "Open last." She was not ready. Ray had told her she would know when she was. By the end of the second week of October, Ellie had done 3 things. She had opened, at Ray's old bank in town, a certificate of deposit account into which she began, one at a time, to transfer the matured bonds. The branch manager, a woman named Sherry, who had known Ray since they were in high school together, took each bond and processed it without a raised eyebrow, and by the end of 2 weeks Ellie had, on paper, cleared just over $86,000 into an account nobody but Sherry and Ellie knew existed. She paid the property tax bill first, in a single check, and Sherry did not say anything at all when Ellie handed it to her. But Sherry's mouth got a little tight, the way a mouth gets when a woman is trying not to smile in a bank. She had begun, on Monday afternoons, to visit the men in the leather book. Roy Peterson had paid her the $340 on the spot, in cash, from a coffee tin in his own kitchen, and had held her hand in both of his for a long moment, and said, "I owed Ray that money for 19 years, Ellie. I am ashamed of that." Milt Anderson she had approached, per Ray's margin note, after church on a Sunday. Milt had paid her $1,200 in a check the following Tuesday. Bud Kransky's son had paid her $6,800 over 3 installments. Curtis O'May she had visited to release. Dean Willoughby had pretended not to remember, and she had shown him the page, and he had gone white and paid her $3,000 of the $4,100 by the end of the week, and promised the rest by Thanksgiving. She had spoken to Prairie Line Equipment Company on the phone twice. She had told them, on the second call in a voice she had not known she possessed, that the number would not be 100. It would be 130, and there would be royalties. The man on the other end had been silent for 4 seconds, and then he had said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I'll get back to you." He had gotten back to her 3 days later. None of this she had told Kevin. None of this she had told Dale. She had told, in fact, no one but Sherry at the bank, and Pete the dog. But by the 3rd week of October, word had begun to move the way word moves in a rural county. Not through any single mouth, but through the way certain checks clear at the local bank. The way certain men suddenly seemed to have paid a widow they had not spoken to in a decade. The way the property tax bill on the Whitaker place had been paid in a single lump sum in cash. Sherry had said nothing. Sherry did not have to. The toolbox, in that 3rd week, still sat on the workbench under the green-shaded lamp. The bonds had gone to the bank. The ledger had gone to the kitchen table drawer. The patent had gone into a fresh manila envelope Ellie had bought specifically to hold it. The cassettes were stacked on the shelf beside the player. Only one thing remained in the toolbox, the sealed manila envelope. For Ellie, open last. She had not opened it. She looked at it every morning. She closed the lid. She locked the shop. She was waiting. She was not sure for what. She would find out later that week that what she had been waiting for was Dale. Because on the afternoon of Thursday, October 26, Dale Whitaker's truck came up her driveway for the first time in 6 weeks. And Dale, when he got out, was not smiling. Before we walk down that driveway with Ellie, and before Dale gets out of that truck, take 1 second. If this story has kept you here this long, if you have been quiet with her at the shop bench and quiet with her at the bank counter, then you are the kind of listener she deserves. Follow this channel. Not for me, for the next widow, the next farm, the next rusted red box somebody laughed at. There are more of these stories than you would think. We tell them one at a time. Dale's truck came up the driveway at 3:15 on Thursday afternoon. Ellie was at the kitchen table with the green ledger open, and Pete was under the table, and the coffee pot was warm on the burner because she had, in the last 3 weeks, gone back to the habit of making a full pot in case somebody dropped by, even though nobody ever did. She heard the truck before she saw it. She recognized the sound of the diesel because Ray had done its last brake job in 2019 and had cursed at its rotors for 2 full days. She did not get up when Dale knocked. She said, "Come in, Dale." He came in. He was wearing his good jacket, the one he had worn to the auction. His face was flushed. He was carrying a folded document in his hand. He said, "Ellie." She said, "Sit down." "Coffee?" He said, "Yeah, all right." She poured him a cup. She did not pour herself one. She sat down across from him and closed the green ledger and folded her hands on top of it. He said, "Ellie, I heard some things." She said, "What things, Dale?" He said, "I heard you paid the property tax." She said, "I did." He said, "In a check." He said, "Where'd you get $8,000? She looked at him. She let the silence sit. Then she said, "Dale, that's not a question a brother-in-law asks a widow." He said, "It is when the widow bought her husband's toolbox at auction for $30 and paid off the county 3 weeks later." Ellie did not answer. Dale took a breath. He softened his voice the way he had softened it 6 weeks ago at this same table when he had first told her about the auction. He said, "Ellie, listen, if there was something in that toolbox, and I'm not saying there was, I'm just saying if, then that's estate property. That's estate property that was sold as is at auction because it was catalogued as tools. If it turned out to be more than tools, that's a defect in the inventory. That has to be reopened." She said, "Does it?" He said, "It does. There's a legal process for it. And I'm the co-executor, Ellie. I have a fiduciary duty." She almost laughed. She did not. She said, "Dale, you have owed my husband $1,800 since August of 2014, and you have not paid him. I know that because he wrote it down. Would you like to talk about your fiduciary duty?" Dale's face changed. It changed in stages, the flush deepening, the jaw tightening, the eyes darting once toward the ledger under her folded hands, and then away. He said, "That's a private matter between me and Ray," she said. "Ray is dead, Dale. It is a matter between you and me now," he said. "That's not what I came here about," she said. "Why did you come here, Dale? Really?" Dale was silent for a long moment. And then, because he was a Whittaker and Whittakers under pressure tell more truth than they mean to, he said the thing he had come to say. He said, "I need money, Ellie. My own operation is going under. I signed on my own place 2 years ago, and Marlene doesn't know. If they sell me out, I lose the ground my grandfather bought, and Marlene will leave me. Ray's estate has value. That toolbox had value. I have a claim. I have to file it. I'm sorry, Ellie. I don't want to. But I have to." He put the folded document on the kitchen table between them. It was a petition, drafted by an attorney in Cedar Rapids, to reopen the estate inventory and to challenge the sale of Lot 47 on grounds of material misrepresentation. Ellie read the petition once through, slowly at the table. She read it the way she had read every document Ray had ever brought home from the bank, or the co-op, or the vet, steadily, without hurrying, her mechanical pencil in her hand, marking small dots in the margin at anything she did not understand or wanted to come back to. She marked 6 dots. The petition alleged 3 things. First, that the toolbox, sold as Lot 47 at the September 24th estate auction, had been catalogued and represented as assorted hand tools, as is, when in fact it contained additional items of substantial value that were not disclosed. Second, that this constituted a material misrepresentation of estate property. Third, that Dale Whittaker, as co-executor, was petitioning the court to reopen the estate inventory, to reclaim the contents of the toolbox beyond the disclosed tools as unadministered estate property, and to have those contents distributed according to the terms of Raymond Whittaker's will, which meant, in practical terms, 1/2 to Ellie and 1/2 to Kevin, with a fiduciary allowance to Dale as co-executor. The deadline for response per the petition was 30 days from service. Dale was serving her now. She looked up. She said, "Dale, do you have an attorney?" He said, "I do." She said, "Well, I'll get one." He said, "Ellie, we can settle this. We really can. I don't want to drag this through a courtroom. If you just tell me what was in there, if we can just agree on a number and split it fair, I don't have to file this. I've got until Monday." She said, "Dale, please leave my house." He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he was gone. Then she got up, took the petition to the front room, and called Sherry at the bank. Sherry told her the name of an attorney in the county seat, a woman named Judith Marsh, in her 60s, who had done Sherry's mother's estate work. Ellie called Judith Marsh's office and left a message. Judith Marsh called her back at 5:40 that afternoon. They met the following morning at Judith's small office above the hardware store in town. Judith was, in appearance, an unhurried woman, reading glasses on a beaded chain, hair pinned up, a mug on her desk that said "World's Okayest Grandma." Ellie brought the petition. She brought in a separate folder, photocopies of the bonds, front and back, all 34, the leather ledger, the patent papers, the letter from Prairie Line, and the auction receipt for Lot 47, signed E.M. Whitaker for $30. Judith read for 40 minutes without saying a word. She sipped her coffee twice. Then she looked up over her reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm going to say 3 things, in order, and then I'd like to ask you one question." Ellie nodded. Judith said, 1. The auction sale of Lot 47 is final. Iowa law is very clear on this. An estate auction sale, once hammered and paid, transfers title in the item as sold. As is, all false. The buyer takes what's inside. That's the whole point of as is. If the executor sold the toolbox with tools in it, and there happened to be additional items inside the toolbox that the executor did not know about, that is a failure of the executor's diligence, not a failure of the sale. The petition's argument for material misrepresentation would require Dale to prove that you knew what was in the box and concealed it. You did not know. You'll swear to that. He can't prove otherwise. Ellie nodded, Judith said. 2. The bonds are not estate property. Series EE savings bonds are non-transferable and titled in the name of the registered owner from the moment of issue. Every one of these bonds was titled in your name from the day Ray Whitaker walked into the bank and bought it. They were, from 1998 forward, your property. They were never part of Ray's estate. Dale has no claim to them under any legal theory I know. Ellie let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Judith said, 3. The ledger of shop debts is more interesting. The debts owed to Ray for shop work performed prior to his death are technically estate assets, but the ledger itself was in your possession, as of the closing of probate on the personal property, and the debts have not been formally administered. Frankly, Mrs. Whitaker, if you continue collecting them one by one, in small amounts, from men who are quietly paying you, and if none of them complains, I would advise you to keep the ledger, keep the receipts, and let the estate's residual accounting reflect that the debts were partially recovered by the surviving spouse in the ordinary course. I will help you with that filing. She set her glasses down. She said, "Now the question. Does Dale Whitaker owe your late husband money that is documented in that ledger?" Ellie said, $1,800 since 2014. Judith Marsh smiled for the first time in the meeting. She said, "Mrs. Whitaker, Dale is not filing this petition against you. Dale is bluffing. He is bluffing because he needs money and he thinks you don't know your own paperwork. When we respond, we will attach the ledger. We will attach that page, and we will invite the court to consider whether a co-executor, who is himself a debtor to the estate, who has never paid what he owes, has clean hands to bring a claim against the surviving spouse. He does not." She paused. She said, "He'll drop it inside a week." She was wrong about one thing. Dale did not drop it inside a week. Kevin drove out from Cedar Rapids on Sunday afternoon. Ellie had not been expecting him. She had not spoken to Kevin since the phone call the night before the auction, and she had not returned his 3 voicemails in the intervening 5 weeks. He knocked. She let him in. He was different. He looked tired. He looked, for the first time in years, like his father in the jaw, the way Ray's face had looked in the late afternoons in the last month. When he was trying to say something he had not yet worked out how to say. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not take off his jacket. He said, "Mom, Dale called me." She said, "I know." He said, "He told me there was money in Dad's toolbox." She said, "There was." He said, "How much?" She looked at him. She looked at her only son for a long moment across the kitchen table where he had eaten every dinner of his childhood, and she thought about what Ray had written in pencil on the underside of a false floor. "He'll want a piece. He hasn't earned a piece." She said, "Kevin, why did you sign for the auction?" He said, "Mom, we've been through this." She said, "We haven't." "Not really. Why did you sign, Kevin?" He was quiet. He said, finally, "Because Dale said it was the smart play. Because I didn't want to deal with it. Because I have 2 kids and a job, and I live an hour and a half away, and I didn't want to come out here every weekend for a year to run Dad's estate. Because it was easier." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "Your father spent 44 years working in that shop. He built me a college fund I didn't know I had. He built a patent I didn't know he'd filed. He wrote down every man who ever cheated him, and every man who ever paid him honest. And he wrote it for me because he knew I'd be the one left to sort it out. And you sold his equipment for auction because it was easier." Kevin put his face in his hands. He said, into his hands, "Mum, I didn't know him." She said, "I know you didn't." The kitchen was very quiet. She said, "Kevin, Dale is going to lose this petition. My attorney has told me so. Dale doesn't have a claim. Nobody has a claim on that toolbox. It was sold at auction for $30 to me. And the law says what was inside is mine. But that's not what you came here to hear." He said, "No." She said, "You came here to ask how much." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Kevin, the number doesn't matter. What matters is what your father wrote to me in pencil on a piece of yellow paper, which was that you would want a piece, and you hadn't earned a piece. That's not me saying that. That's him." Kevin looked up. His eyes were wet. He said, "Mom, I know that. I'm not asking for a piece. I'm asking what I have to do." She looked at him. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "You have to call Dale and tell him to drop the petition. Today. And you have to tell him that if he doesn't drop it, you will testify against him in probate court about the $1,800, which you will do because I'm going to give you the ledger page and you're going to read it. And after that, Kevin, I don't know yet. We'll see what happens after that. But that's the first thing, and I want you to do it before you leave this kitchen." Kevin took out his phone. He called Dale. Ellie sat and drank her coffee, cold now, and listened to her son's voice on the phone with her brother-in-law. He was firm. He was not cruel. He was for the first time in a long time his father's son. When he hung up, he set the phone down on the table and he said, "He's dropping it." He said, "He's dropping it." She said, "Good." He said, "Mom, I'm going to go." She said, "Okay." He stood in the doorway. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." She said, "I know." He went. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time. Pete was at her feet. The green-shaded lamp was on in the shop across the yard, because she had left it on that morning and forgotten. She could see it from the kitchen window, a small warm circle in the pole barn's tin doorway. She thought, now. She stood up. She got her coat. She walked out to the shop in the cold October dusk with Pete behind her, and she opened the toolbox one last time. Only the envelope was left. She sat down at the workbench. She picked up the envelope. On the front, in raised block letters, it said, "For Ellie, open last." She turned it over. She broke the seal. The envelope has been in a rusted red toolbox for 11 months and 3 days. Ray sealed it, she now understands, in the last week of his life. The letter is dated January 3rd, 2024, 3 days before he died, in the shakier version of his block letters that had begun to appear in the last month, when his right hand had lost some of its grip. Inside the envelope are 2 things: a folded letter, 3 pages, and, clipped to the letter with a rusted paperclip, the 3rd cassette. Ellie, last. She reads the letter first. "Ellie, by the time you open this, you already know what was in the box. So I don't need to tell you the money part. I need to tell you the other part. I left you the toolbox because I trusted you to finish. Kevin would have spent it. Dale would have swallowed it. You will build with it. Buy the south pasture back. Open the shop. Put a boy on the bench and teach him to hold the wrench the way my grandfather taught me. Thumb toward the work, not away from it. The land is the point. The shop is the point. You are the point. I loved you in a language I was not good at speaking out loud. Let this be the last word in it. Ray, she reads it once. She reads it twice. The third time her hand is shaking hard enough that she has to set the paper on the workbench and hold it flat with her palm to read it. Pete stands up from the concrete and comes over and pushes his head against her thigh. She puts one hand on his head. She sits like that for a long while, one hand flat on Ray's letter, the other on Pete's grey muzzle, and the shop is silent except for the small ticking sound the green-shaded lamp makes when it has been on for a long time. Then she reaches for the cassette player, and she puts in the third tape. She presses play. If you're playing this one, then you found the envelope. Play me out first. I want to say the thing I never said enough. 44 years, Ellie. I was not an easy man on the outside, but every dollar in that toolbox has your name on it, because every dollar in this life had your name on it. You earned every cent of what I hid from them, not because you asked, because you stayed. The tape hisses. Ray coughs. A pause. And then, in a voice that is very tired and very clear, he says, "All right, Ellie, that's all. Turn it off. Go build." The tape ends. She sits with her hand on the cassette player for a long moment. She does not press stop. The tape just runs out on its own, the way tape does, into the soft click of the end reel. She reaches over and turns off the machine. She takes the cassette out. She holds it in her hand. She thinks about how many hours of the last 11 months Ray must have spent, alone in the front bedroom, with a small tape recorder Kevin had given him one Christmas, working out what to say. 3 tapes. Not many minutes total. Enough. She puts the cassette back in its case. She sets it on the workbench beside the letter. She does not cry. That is not the shape of what is happening. What is happening is quieter and larger than crying. It is the sound of 44 years arriving, all at once, in a rusted red toolbox on a workbench, under a green-shaded lamp in a pole barn in Iowa in the late October dusk. The number, when Judith Marsh sits down with Ellie, 2 weeks later at the small office above the hardware store to close out the estate, comes to this. Approximately $86,000 in matured Series EE savings bonds, transferred into Ellie's certificate of deposit account. $41,200 in shop debts, of which $34,800 have already been collected in cash and small checks over the course of 6 weeks, and of which the rest is on payment plans Ellie herself has drawn up in the back of the green ledger. A signed assignment agreement from Prairie Line Equipment Company for the hay baler tension modification patent, at a lump sum figure of $120,000. Prairie Line came up from 100, not to 130. And Judith Marsh advised her to take it because the royalty schedule, calibrated at $3 per unit manufactured, was where the real long money would sit. The rough total, on paper, $247,000, with a royalty stream Prairie Line's own projections estimated $18,000 to $22,000 a year for the next 8 to 10 years. The rough total, in feeling, something no ledger has a column for. Ellie signs the papers. Judith Marsh hands her the pen. Judith says, "Mrs. Whitaker, congratulations." Ellie does not correct her, but privately she thinks, "No, Judith." Ray is congratulated. "I was already here." Dale drops the petition on the Monday after Kevin's phone call. He does not withdraw it in person. He signs a notice through his attorney and it is filed on the courthouse docket, with 3 lines of legalese and no explanation. 2 months later, he sells 40 acres of his own ground to a neighbor for less than it is worth, and he and Marlene move to a rental house in the next county over. And word comes back through the co-op that Marlene did in fact find out about the loan, and did not, in the end, leave, but that Dale does not come into town anymore, and does not attend the auction sales he used to run the front row of, and does not, for the rest of Ellie's story, appear in her kitchen or her driveway, or her life again. Kevin comes back the second Sunday in November. He brings the granddaughters. He does not stay long, and he does not ask for anything. He asks his mother if there is a fence line she needs walked. She says, "Yes, actually, there is. The one down by the creek on the south pasture, the one Ray talked about on the second tape. Kevin walks it with her. He does not know he is walking a fence line his father recorded onto a cassette tape, 11 months before he died. Ellie does not tell him. Some things belong to her alone. The men in the leather ledger, all 22 of them, are paid off or released by the end of March. Only 2 of them, in the end, refuse to pay. One because he is broke, and Ellie releases him per Ray's margin note, and one because he is stubborn. And Ellie writes his name in the back of the green ledger with a small mark beside it. That means, in Whitaker shorthand, remember for both of us. In late November, Ellie drives into the county seat one Thursday morning, and using part of the patent lump sum, she buys back the south pasture from the neighbor to whom it had been sold at the estate settlement. 80 acres. She pays in a single certified check. The neighbor, an older man named Wendell, who had bought it because it adjoined his own 80, and who had, quietly, always suspected the day would come, sells it back at what he paid for it. He does not raise the price. He says, at the closing, "Ellie, I've been holding it for you. I didn't know I was, but I was." She says, "Thank you, Wendell." That afternoon she drives to the pole barn, and she stands in the shop doorway and she looks at it. The empty pegboards, the empty vices, the workbench under the green-shaded lamp, the rusted red toolbox at the center of the bench with its lid open, and she thinks about what Ray said. Put a boy on the bench. She calls the co-op the next morning. She asks the manager if he knows any kid, 15 or 16, whose father works at the co-op, who is quiet, who is patient, who has hands that want to know how a thing works. He gives her 2 names. She calls the first family that evening. By the first week of December there is a boy named Jesse Hollister. Jim Hollister's nephew, the same Jim who had paid $1,200 into the leather ledger, coming out to the shop 3 afternoons a week after school. Ellie is not the one teaching him. She has hired, out of the Prairie Line money, a retired machinist from Anamosa named Carl Bosch, who had worked with Ray in 1988, and who knew him and knew what he did. Carl teaches, Ellie watches. Pete lies on the concrete. The first day Jesse comes to the shop, Carl hands him a wrench. It is Ray's grandfather's wrench, a craftsman from the 1940s, the handle worn smooth by 3 generations of Whitaker hands. The head still bright where the paint had worn away long ago. Ellie has taken it out of the toolbox for exactly this purpose and put it on the bench. Carl says, "All right, kid. First thing, thumb toward the work, not away from it." Jesse holds it wrong at first, and then he holds it right. Ellie stands in the shop doorway with her hands in the pockets of her cardigan, and she watches. She does not say anything. She has not, so far as anyone would notice, done anything. She has simply stayed. She has stayed the way she has stayed for 44 years. Ray was right. It was the point. There would be one more thing to do. She had not yet closed the toolbox. The winter that year was cold in the ordinary way, and long in the ordinary way, and by the middle of January there was snow to the tops of the fence posts on the south pasture, and the shop was warm because Ellie had put a new wood stove into the corner, and Carl had installed the flue himself as a favor. Jesse came 3 afternoons a week and stayed until his father picked him up. Carl came on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and on Saturday. By February there was a second boy, Andy Kransky, Bud Kransky's grandson, 12 years old and small for his age, but with a good ear for the sound of a bearing gone bad. And Carl taught them both, and Ellie kept the books. The shop began, in a small way, to take work again. Not much. A hay baler rebuilt for Milt Anderson, a welding job for the Larsons, a tractor transmission teardown for Roy Peterson, who paid up front in cash. Ellie did the estimates. Ellie kept the green ledger open on the workbench and wrote every job down in her own hand. When she wrote a job down, she wrote it under the same column heading Ray had used in the leather book, R. Whitaker, Shop Acts. She had never taken his name off the top of the ledger. She did not intend to. The south pasture, in the spring, she rented out to Wendell for grazing at a fair rate. Wendell asked her if she wanted the money in cash or in a check. She said cash, and put it in a coffee tin above the stove, and used it, over the course of the summer, to pay Carl's wages. The Prairie Line royalty checks began to arrive in March. The first one was for $4,380. She held it up to the kitchen light for a long moment before she took it to Sherry at the bank. Kevin came out more often that year, every other weekend, sometimes with the girls, sometimes alone. He did not ask her, again, how much. He never asked her again. What he asked her, in June, sitting on the porch after supper, was whether she would come out to Cedar Rapids for the older girls' dance recital. She said she would. She did not, in the end, tell him about the letter Ray had written her. She did not play him the tapes. Some of what Ray had left her was for her alone, and she had decided, sometime in November, that she would keep it that way. Ray had trusted her to know the difference between what was for her and what was for the family. She kept the leather book on the shop bench. She kept the cassettes on the shelf above it. She kept the letter, folded, in the drawer of her bedside table, with her mother's photograph and her own wedding band from the auction, because in April, quietly, without saying anything to anyone, she had driven to Waterloo, walked into the jeweler's, and bought her own ring back for $850. She wore it again. She did not tell anyone. Late September of the following year, 1 year to the day since the auction, Ellie walks out to the shop in the early afternoon. The light on the pole barn's tin roof is the color Ray had once, on a cassette tape she has not played since, said he would have painted if he had been a different kind of man. The corn is coming down on the neighbor's field. Pete, older now, stiffer in the hips, walks slower behind her, but he still comes. She opens the shop door. Jesse is 16 now. He has grown a full inch since December. Carl is at his elbow. On the bench in front of them, open, its lid raised on its old hinge, is the rusted red toolbox. The friction-taped handle is the same handle. The dent on the left corner of the lid is the same dent. The brown paper auction tag is gone. Ellie took it out of her cardigan pocket months ago and pinned it to the underside of the shop's shelf above the workbench, where nobody can see it, unless they know to look. Inside the toolbox, on top of everything else, because Ellie has put the ordinary hand tools back inside, the wrenches and the screwdrivers and the ball-peen hammer and the tape measure with the split case, exactly the way Ray kept them, exactly in the order Ray kept them, sits one wrench, Ray's grandfather's wrench. Craftsman 1940s, the handle worn smooth. Jesse is holding it, he is holding it correctly, thumb toward the work. Carl says, "All right, now feel where it wants to go." Jesse turns the wrench a quarter turn. The bolt gives. Ellie stands in the doorway. She does not speak. The green-shaded lamp is on above the bench, throwing its small, warm circle of light across the tools and across the toolbox and across the boy's hands. Pete lies down on the concrete at Ellie's feet. $30, she thinks. $30 in a coffee tin on a Saturday in September. She had not known that day what she was buying. She had known only that Ray had wanted her to buy it. She had trusted him. She trusts him now. She stands in the doorway a moment longer, and then she closes the door softly behind her, so as not to disturb the boy at the bench. And she walks back to the house with her hands in her cardigan pockets, and Pete a step behind her. The lamp stays on in the shop. It is on for a long time.